Hi, welcome to this free SimplyMaya tutorial on multipass rendering in Maya and compositing in Nuke. Now the purpose of this tutorial is to get you quickly started with pass rendering in Maya, and by this I mean breaking your render up into separate render passes. Now these could be anything from a diffuse pass, a specular pass, a shadow pass. The intention is to get all of these separate individual passes out of Maya to give you more control over the render process. So for example, if I was to render this, I have it already done here. This image took a minute to render. The problem is we have no control over it now. We could take it into Photoshop and tweak the overall brightness, but we don't have individual control of the shadows, the specular highlights, the ambient occlusion. What we need is a greater degree of control. So what we're going to do is we're going to split this render up into separate passes, and then we're going to recomposite that, in our case with Nuke, although you could do this with After Effects or any manner of compositing program really. Now, to get started, what I want to do is open up the render settings window, and what we want first of all is a diffuse and a specular pass. So if I go under passes, and it's actually quite simple to do this, you just click this button here. We're going to go diffuse without shadows, simply because we're going to do a separate shadow pass. We're then going to go specular without shadows, so if we go down to specular without shadows, and these passes are in, but they need to be associated, so you need to click them and just click this green clapboard icon here. If we go now and we render, I will show you how you can view your passes. Just give it 1 second to render, it shouldn't take so long. I had indirect lighting on the other one. And if we go now, load render pass, specular no shadow, you'll see that there is our specular no shadow pass. And we can look at the other pass, diffuse no shadow. So here is our diffuse pass with no shadows. Now we have two of these passes. If we combined them together, it would mean that we would have more control over our specular highlights, and indeed more control over the whole image output altogether. So we're also going to want another couple of passes for this tutorial. We're going to go back and we're going to add, under the passes here, we're going to add a shadow pass. And we're also going to add a ambient occlusion pass. So now I've got those in, I'll just associate them. Oops. So here we have our 4 passes that we're going to use, and I normally include a beauty pass as well. So I'll just put that one in. And I encourage you to play with this, add some more passes, see what they do. But for our intents and purposes, this is supposed to be a very quick guide to get you started with the basics. So we're just going to use these 5 passes. Now, one thing that has to be said, because we've included ambient occlusion, we have to go to Features, and under here, just tell it to actually use ambient occlusion. Now, if we hit render again, now we've got our other passes, we'll be able to see those passes as well. You will notice that this slows down now because it's calculating the ambient occlusion. When this is finished, we'll take a look at the ambient occlusion, and I'll give you a few tips of how to speed that up even with the ambient occlusion turned on. Okay, our render is done here, and you can see it took 1 minute 15 seconds with the ambient occlusion. And if we go to load render passes again and hit AO, you will see that we have now stored in our frame passes, in the actual frame buffer from mental ray and ambient occlusion pass, we have our shadow pass that we did. So there is the shadow pass. And here is our beauty pass, which is basically all these other passes together. So there you go. Now what we need to do is a few things before we can take this to begin compositing it. Now one thing is, when we pick an image format to render out in, if you pick something like JPEG, obviously you're going to have a lossy image, so that's probably not what you want to store your renders in. You could use TIFF, Targra, PNG. Any of these are absolutely fine for everyday use. lossless formats. The problem stems from the fact that what we want to do is create different passes. So already we have 5 passes, well 4 passes plus the beauty pass. So what that's going to do for us is write out 5 separate images. Now if we're doing a long animation, we're going to have a lot of images to organize. So when I'm rendering out render passes, I like to use OpenExr, which is a format by Industrial Light and Magic, which basically puts all the passes into one file. It's got a lot of other great features for it as well. I suggest you Google OpenExr if you're interested in the format. But for our purposes, all this is going to do is jam all of those passes together in one file, so when it comes time to manage our render passes later on, we have one file containing all those passes. Nice, simple, easy to use. Now there is a few more things to do before we actually go to the compositing program. What we need to do is, if you double click on AO, and I said before that the render took a lot longer because by default Maya uses, I believe, 64 rays in its ambient occlusion render. Now if that's taking too long for you, you can double click the AO pass here, go to use local AO settings and define your own ambient occlusion settings. Now that was new, I think, for either Maya 2010 or 11, so if you're on an earlier version you'll either have to render out a separate ambient occlusion layer altogether, or you'll just have to live with Maya's default settings. But anyway, so we have our passes. Let's just check here. We have our format set to OpenExr. There is something else we need to do. We need to make sure we have ambient occlusion ticked. We do. Under quality, you need to go down, because we're storing all this information in this EXR, we're going to use a 32-bit image. So you need to go down in quality under frame buffer and change it from the default 8-bit image to an RGB alpha 32-bit float, which is this one. Okay, so now I'm using a 32-bit image, which allows us to store much more information in the image. So let me just check our settings here. Okay, I'm not going to mess around with this too much because our purpose here is just to get this out into a compositing program so we can start to edit it there. So this is it. This is everything. I'm also going to make sure that my name number extension is set here. It's not set to single frame, it's set to this, and my start frame is 1 and my end frame is 1. Now the reason for this is, if I was to try and save this now as an EXR, you won't see it in the list here. So what I'm going to have to do to get this EXR out of Maya is, again, go into the render settings, make sure that start and end frame are on 1, or if you're rendering out an animation, of course, we're just going to do a batch render here, but we're just going to batch 1 frame. So make sure this is set, and frame padding if you need it, if you're doing more than 1 frame, make sure OpenExr is on. Okay. We need to go up to the rendering tab, render, batch render, and you'll see down here result rendering with mental ray. There have been some reports of some versions of Maya 2011 having some problems with batch rendering if you don't save your scene file before you render. So if this does throw up an error for you, save your scene file, try again. It could be that that's the problem you're having. But as you can see here, we've now started to render out our Multipass 001 EXR image. This will go quite quickly. It takes a while to get started, but this should take 1 minute 15 seconds, the same as our render here. And when that's done, we're going to bring this into Nuke. We're going to separate out all those layers. So we're going to separate out the specular layer, the shadows, the diffuse layer, and the ambient occlusion within Nuke. We're then going to composite them all back together, thus giving ourselves a much greater degree of control. So I'm going to drop into Nuke now, and I will see you in a second when that render is finished. Okay, so Maya's finished our render, and here we are in Nuke. This is just a blank Nuke project. I'm going to hit R for read, and I'm going to just select my Multipass EXR, which will be in the images folder of your Maya project directory. So there we go. I'm just going to connect this up to the viewer by dragging it here. And the first thing you'll notice when we come into Nuke is this image is a lot lighter than the one we had in Maya. This is because we're working with a 32-bit image, so the color space for this is in linear. It's not sRGB gamma corrected. We're going to deal with that in the end of this tutorial. It's quite a simple way of dealing with that. I'm not going to go into color theory or linear workflow or any of that. This is supposed to be a quick, simple way for you to start basic compositing in Nuke and getting multiple passes out of Maya. So now I'm here in my viewer, and this is showing me what channels I'm seeing at the moment. So I'm seeing the RGB alpha. If I click this down, we can flick it over to the ambient occlusion we rendered. We can flick it again to the beauty pass. We can flick it again to the diffuse with no specular highlights and no shadow. We can flick it up to the shadows, or we can flick it over to the specular highlights. Now, with all these different pieces of information in this file, it's going to make our post-production process and being able to control the look of our final render a lot easier than it would have been within Maya. We won't have to re-render, we won't have to tweak a bit of specular. We just have an overall greater degree of control. So the first thing I want to do is split all these passes out from this main file. So I'm going to change my viewer back here to RGB alpha, and I'm just going to create a shuffle node. I'm going to connect this to our image here. Just drag it along, you'll see it connected, and I'm going to double click it. And basically I'm going to select for the first one the diffuse, and you'll see here this is the diffuse in, but it's got red, green, blue and blue twice. This is because none of the passes have an alpha channel. If you need the alpha channel, you can use the one that's contained in the beauty pass, but that's a subject for a different day. But for right now, we don't want this blue twice. So we're just going to flick this from RGBA to RGB, and you'll see now we just have red, green and blue. So this then would be the diffuse pass. So I'm going to double click it and rename it. Just call it diffuse. And if I now connect this to the image viewer, press 2 on the keyboard, you can see here this one's connected 1, this one's connected 2, and you'll see that we have out of this thing, our shuffle node, we have this diffuse with no specular. So the next thing I want to do is create another shuffle node, connect it again to the image, and this time I want to do the spec. So I'll just do the specular here. I will select the specular, no shadow here, and again we don't want this blue being used as the alpha channel, the fake alpha channel, because it doesn't have one, so we're just specular to RGB. So if I click this to the viewer now and hit 3, there we go. So there is your beauty pass. In fact, I'll unconnect that. It doesn't matter, by the way, it's just what you can see in the viewer. It's just a nice way of keeping track of what you're working with. And there you go, diffuse, specular, split up. We now need to split off the shadows, which we'll do with yet another shuffle node. Let's try and keep this a little bit organized. So again, just rename it first so we know what's what, and we want to go from the shadow pass again into RGB. I'll connect this to the viewer, and you can see here that that is our shadow pass. So again, another shuffle node, and if you've rendered out more passes for indirect lighting, there's lots of passes you can render out in Maya, lots of other information. Again, once again, I urge you to experiment, but you just need one of these shuffle nodes at a basic level to do what we're doing here. So again, another shuffle node, and this will be our ambient occlusion. So there we go, and I'll select ambient occlusion here, RGB here, and I'll connect this to the viewer, and you can see we have there our ambient occlusion. So shadows, diffuse with no shadows, specular with no shadows, and ambient occlusion. So there's all our passes out, everything we want to deal with, and I'll just uncouple these from the viewer. Now, before I do anything else, I'm just going to select each one of these and hit C. This will just add a color correction node to each one of these. I like to put it in here. Sometimes you won't need it, but I like to have it anyway, and this will just allow you to correct the color, tweak the color of each of these particular nodes. I'll give you an example if we hook this one up to the AO. So here's our ambient occlusion. If we're not happy with this ambient occlusion, now we've hooked in this color correction node, we can grab the contrast on the midtones, let's say, and knock it down a bit or knock it out a bit. It just gives us a very flexible degree of control on our each individual pass here. So now we need to merge these passes together, which I'm going to do by hitting M on the keyboard, which will give me a merge node. And what I want to do is connect the B to what will be the background, which will be the diffuse, and the A to the spec. If I then grab this and fling it into the viewer, you can see here that this just looks like our specular highlight. This is because our merge node here is set to over. We want a plus operation. So what we have now is no shadows, no ambient occlusion. We have the diffuse and the spectacular. So if I take this, and you'll see here that mix node, if I turn this down, it will slowly turn the specular highlights off. So already in this we have a far greater level of control over our specular highlights than we ever would have had in Maya. In Maya, if we needed to dampen our spec down, we would have ended up re-rendering. If this was over hundreds of frames, you could spend potentially days re-rendering, rendering test renders, trying to get your spec light to look right. Whereas here we have a great degree of how much specularity we add, either all of it or none of it, or anywhere in between, of course. And because we have the color correction node attached to it, we can actually control it as well with the many controls under a color correction node. You can also add other Nuke nodes here, but that's beyond the purview of this particular tutorial. So there is our diffuse and specular mixed together. What we want to do now is introduce our shadows. So I'm going to hit M again for merge, and B we'll use as the background, so this will be this merge node, and A is the foreground, which will be, in this case, our shadows. And then we'll connect this merge node to the viewer, so 2. And at the moment you can only see the shadows. You don't get this diffuse and specular mix. This is simply because, again, our merge operation is set to over. And for shadows, I want to set it to difference. So now you can see that this has introduced our shadows. If I hit our merge node and mix it, you can see here our shadows going on and off. So again, a great degree of control about how much shadow you actually want. You also have that color correct node there that we put in to be able to play with that to an even greater degree of control. And the last one we want is the ambient occlusion. So again, hit M, connect the B to this one. We're just making a big chain here basically. Connect the A to this one, and then connect this to the viewer. So that's gone as viewer connection 3. And again, you'll just see the AO. You won't see the shadows, the spec, or the diffuse, because again, it's been set to over by default. And for ambient occlusion, I'm going to use multiply. Okay, and now we have everything mixed together. Our spec, our diffuse, our shadows, our ambient occlusion. In fact, you can see what it looks like if I take the ambient occlusion off. So you can see there exactly what the ambient occlusion is doing for you. You can edit the ambient occlusion to be more or less darker or brighter. You can blur it, smudge it out. There's a myriad of things you can do with it. I'll leave that to you. So I'm just going to pull this viewer out. There is one last thing we'll have to do with this. Because Nuke is working with a 32-bit image, it's working in linear space, which is why our image actually looks a lot brighter than it does in Maya. So you want to grade this, and before you write it out to a file, and stick it back to a sRGB color gamma corrected image. So I'm just going to hit G and stick in a grade node. I'm going to put that as the last in the chain, so I hook it up here and here, and that will be 2 on our viewer. It won't do anything, we need to set it, so I'm going to take the gamma to 0.45, and that's what our image should actually look like, which is fairly similar to the one we had in Maya, now albeit on a darker background. And in fact, if you want to tinker with the background on this, we can put a constant in here in Nuke This is just a quick way of doing it. I'll specify a new size. I know this render is 1000 by 500. That's 100, sorry. And the size, we'll just call it new. Okay, so we'll get rid of this. We'll put in another merge node here. And we'll make this our background, this our foreground. And we will then connect this to the viewer here. There we go. If I hit 1 now, you'll see that by controlling the color of this, I can actually control the color of our background. It's just being, it's underneath the image. It's using the alpha channel. And there we go. So if you do have a render, you can also come in. You don't have to play with your camera environment. You can just do that whole thing in Nuke as well. You can put a proper background image in there. A ton of things you can do, again, outside the purview of this tutorial. All we want to do with this is to get you rendering out separate passes in Maya and doing your composites in Nuke. You could also use After Effects. The principles are the same. And there you go. Fairly easy, really. We'll just put this grade node back in. There we go. So there you have it. And again, you've got, your huge level of control compared to what you would have in Maya to tweak this image and to get it to look exactly how you want it to. So I hope that's been informational, and I will see you on the forum as always.